So let's talk a bit more about pastoral care and counselling. And one of the things you'll have picked up on is that presuppositions matter. That when you look at different approaches to therapy and counselling, you'll realise that underpinning them is a worldview and a belief about how this world functions, a belief about how we function as people. In fact, when we think about a worldview, we are thinking about the big questions. Who are we? What is our identity as human beings? And that relates to a couple of other things. It relates to our understanding of this world around us. What is this world like? Where did it come from? And it's related as well to our understanding of what is beyond that, if you like, the even bigger picture still. So in other words, as Christians, we're thinking about what is this world like? Where did we come from? We're thinking about creation as Christians in terms of is there something beyond? The answer is yes. And that links to the where did we come from, that we believe in God. So who is God and what is he like? And of course there's another dynamic to that sense of worldview. There's that question about where are we going? What does the future hold? So for us as Christians, that means the worldview that we hold, it has big questions about new creation. Do we have that sure and certain hope of resurrection and eternal life and a new creation with God, with Jesus? And we're going to come back to that, because one of the things that I try to do when I'm working with somebody is think through those big issues. What do they believe about God, creation, new creation, and about themselves, about humanity? And do they believe truth or lies about those things? I also want to be thinking about how they know what they know. What is their source of revelation? And in fact, those are the big things that we actually work through on Faith Roots. That's some of the bigger training and teaching that we've got available, that we're working through on Faith Roots, and that I'd encourage you to start to look at. In other words, if you want to be a good counsellor, a good pastoral carer, a good discipler, if you want to be good at walking with people through life, through suffering, a good pastor, a good shepherd, a good church leader, even a good brother and sister in Christ, then actually you want to have good theology, good doctrine. But that's a bit that's a bit sort of outside of today. What I wanted to do today was to simply come back to that situation in the counselling room, and to think about our understanding of humanity and about the human condition, and therefore our understanding of the person who is sitting in front of us in that room, or walking beside us if we're just going out for a chat. What do we think about them? And I want to pick up on a couple of things here that I would encourage you to do some further follow-up and some further thinking about. What do we know about that person? Well, here's the first thing we know about them. They are made in God's image. And it's important that we start with that they are image bearers. And that's going to affect how we approach them, how we engage with them. That we approach them with that sense of their dignity, their value that arises out of that. And we want to treat them with that right sense of dignity and respect because of it. The person you are counselling is not someone for you to boss about and control. The person that you are counselling is not there, as so often I think has been treated in a lot of the sort of the research and discussions about psychiatry and psychology and those kinds of things, as a kind of a lab rat to be scrutinised and examined as much for your own case notes and your own write-ups as for helping them. And made in God's image, and therefore made with the potential and with the purpose of doing a couple of things. What were we made for? What does it mean to be made in God's image? Well, here's a couple of things. It means that we were made as worshippers. That if we were made by the Creator God, then actually our first thing is that we were made to enjoy Him and glorify Him forever. And that person sat in front of you, if they are not yet a Christian, then they are still there with the potential to be a worshipper. That's what they were made for. And if they are a Christian, then they are a worshipper. And in fact, that keeps us thinking about what is the big goal out of this. Well, the big goal is to go back to the big goal for all humanity, that their chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Therefore, the chief end of any work we do with someone is that they may glorify God and enjoy Him forever. As well as being made as worshippers, because we are made in God's image and given responsibilities in creation, we see that humanity is told to fill and subdue creation, not just to multiply, but we were made to care for, to steward, to rule in a godly way this creation, to be God's image bearers here, God's representatives. And that is something that we should be thinking about. What does it mean for that person in their context to be doing that? To be someone who is filling and subduing, who is stewarding, who is cultivating, who is nurturing, who is populating this world. And what that means, what that will look like, will be different for different people, won't it? It's different for a single person, a young single person. It's different for to it is for a married person. It's different, or a married couple. And I think it's interesting to think about what we see as the aims when we do marriage counselling, isn't it? It is different for an older person to a younger person. It will be different on your context. It will be different if you're thinking about life at work or life in the family, those kinds of things. But it's helpful to have that starting point. Thirdly, is it thirdly? No. Yes, thirdly. Sorry, I'm going on in circles here. Secondly, so we are made in God's image as worshippers and workers, if you like, to destroy God's creation. Secondly, we are fallen. So in Adam, all sinned, and that's a crucial starting point for Christians. And what it means is this, that when we look at suffering and persecution and struggle and strife, then we do want to pay attention to the sense in which it is caused by sin. that we see the root in sin in a general sense. And sometimes it will be directly, my own personal sin will directly lead to suffering. But sometimes it's in that sense that we suffer because of that general sense in which we are all under the effects of sin. And so as well as being fallen ourselves, we live in a fallen world. And that means that we also start to think about our understanding of those wider pictures about what we believe about creation. But that is for a later day, isn't it? But what this means is that when we are talking with someone, we are counselling someone, we are seeking to look at them and to help them as people who are both sinners and sufferers. And it's important to get both of them, because I think that at times we've been tempted to overemphasize one or the other at the risk of missing the other part to that statement. We are sinners and sufferers. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, a lot of, the way that this world focuses and where a lot of secular counselling tends to risk focusing is to get the sense that we are sufferers, that we experience pain and suffering for a number of reasons. We experience pain and suffering just because of the imperfect nature of this world. So there are things that happen that are part of the natural state of affairs. Not natural in terms of this is what it was meant to be like, but natural in terms of what it is like. The stresses and the pain of life. And so we experience the heat and the sweat and the toil, and that has an impact. If you are physically injured whilst out doing physical work, then you can see that immediately. You think about Genesis 3 saying then it's going to be by the sweat of your brow. If you are struggling with mental illness, emotional illness, with depression, with anxiety, then that may also be because of the impact of this fallen world around us, just the grind, the toil, the challenges. Think of how people might suffer trauma and PTSD that is a consequence of pain and suffering in childhood. So we suffer because of the world around us. Because that is how it is as a fallen world. But we also suffer because of what other people do. Because of the failings of other people. Because of their sin, whether direct and intentional towards us, or their sin, malicious, or their sin where we are talking about their carelessness, their neglect, their thoughtlessness, sins of commission and omission, if you like, what they have said and done that they should not have said or done, sins of omission, not what they should have said and done but they did not. So we are sufferers, but we are also sinners. And if we are focused on the sufferer bit, we can miss personal responsibility and what we have done. But of course, we can then focus on the other end, and this is where I think certainly the early phases of the biblical counselling movement and J. Adams, where their weak point was that they were very quick to say that the cause of your suffering now is sin. The risk that became this kind of almost a prosperity gospel type mindset. I can directly link this particular bad thing that's happened to you because of your sin, and therefore repent the sin, use the right words of faith, use the right approaches, and you're going to get better from this. And it could also be very harsh, even to the point where, because there was such a desire to emphasize the root cause being sin, that if it wasn't your sin in the first place that was the cause of your suffering, then the suggestion became that your suffering and your mental anguish is itself a sinful response to what is happening around you. And by the way, we can sin in our response to suffering. But I think that J. Adams overloaded that as a kind of as a default assumption that it is sin. However, the fact that we are sinners does matter. And it matters for two reasons. Reason number one, because as I said, there can be a wrong response to what is happening to us, that we can hold on to blame, and that can become bitterness if we forget that we too are sinners, and that therefore we, just as much as those that we believe have wronged us, need God's forgiveness, are justified by faith alone. And furthermore, I think sometimes what can happen with us, sometimes where we need to be challenged, is that we are tempted to blame God. And I've even seen evangelical Christians talking about learning to be angry at God, learning to let off steam at him. I want to be very clear, I don't think there's any place, any biblical warrant for that. That if we are blaming God, it might be because we have forgotten that we are sinners, that we all sinned in Adam, and therefore we are experiencing the just consequences of sin. But the other reason why we need to remember that we are sinners is because our sin itself does lead to suffering. But sometimes, maybe we should say often, that is where we need to start to look, that it is my own responsibility, the things that I have thought, the things that I have said, the things that I have done that have caused pain and suffering, have caused struggle. And therefore we want to identify the root cause. And then here's the final point here. I think once we start to address the issue of sin in all its seriousness and start to kind of get an anatomy of sin and an understanding of it, it takes us deeper. What do I mean by that? Well, I think one of the reasons why some of us may be cautious or nervous about starting to delve deep is that what we want to say is a person has confessed, they've repented, the sin has been identified and addressed, it's forgiven, so move on. And I think at that point we're not really getting a full grasp of what lies behind it, the true root causes, and how entangling this is. So some of you may have seen that I've got a little video series on sin and desire and temptation. I'm not going to say much more about that here. I'd encourage you to go and watch that video series, and it picks up on some debates and discussions that people have been having, but the aim is to get to this practical alertness and awareness that sinful thoughts, sinful words, sinful actions don't just come out of nowhere. James talks about how our desires, our disordered desires, perhaps even our sinful desires, our evil desires, how they tempt us. These distorted, disordered desires tempt us into sin, and so they conceive sin, and sin gives birth to death. So what we want to be thinking about is not just, this is what I've done wrong, or said wrong, or even thought wrong, but where did that come from? And that can be a whole host of complex causes. But by getting back to where our desires are, where our affections are, we start to think about how they are disordered and how they need to be reordered. We start to think about how once we know and understand those things, we can resist temptation. Because the risk is this, isn't it? The risk is that if I just say, oh, that was the sin, identified it, repented of it, dealt with it, won't do that again. And if I just think in terms of what can I do to avoid being tempted in that area, to resist temptation on that specific sin, you know, the old, if you're an alcoholic, don't walk past the pub, take a different walk home kind of thing, then I think I can be kind of naive in that, can't I? That I can miss the point that the desire will find another way to tempt us. A bit like in the Second World War, there's this famous incident of how the British were set up to defend, I think was it Malaysia and Singapore, against the Japanese, and they had all of these big guns ready, but they were pointing the wrong way. They expected expected a sea attack, and the Japanese came in through the jungle and surprised them. We can have all of our spiritual guns pointing the wrong way if we don't understand what is behind. You know, get back to those root causes so that we're ready to resist. And the reason why we want to do that again is remember that our aim is not just to help people survive or even to escape from suffering, but actually we want people to be godly, we want them to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And therefore we're not just looking for sort of minor corrections to escape from situations where we're thinking bigger than that. We're thinking about how to be holy, and therefore how to put to death sin and sinful desire, how to resist and say no to temptation, to say no to sin and yes to good and to God. So the person we are counselling is made in God's image, lives in a fallen world, and is fallen themselves, so that on the one hand they are meant to worship God, meant to work for God, stewarding his creation, filling and subduing his creation, but are both sufferers and sinners. And here's just one last point. We've talked about our understanding of the person sat in front of us. But what about the other person in the room? The person that you look at in the mirror each day? Well, those same things are true of you and me as well, so that we have a responsibility as those seeking to shepherd others, care for others, counsel others, that we guard our own hearts and lives too. Thank you for watching in.